Russia is absorbing massive pressure at home. Unrest unfolding in Tehran makes that pressure sharper and more dangerous. For Moscow, Iran's unrest is not a side theater. It amplifies the pressure on the Kremlin's weakest points. That pressure is already showing up in Moscow itself. A growing sense of insecurity changes how the elites gauge their exposure. The protective narrative around Putin is beginning to run thin. Putin sells Russians a myth where he frames the war against Ukraine as a global confrontation that Russia is supposedly winning soon. He claims that Russia is fighting not only Ukraine, but a united West that is behind it. That story is how he demands hardships from his nation and promises that it'll pay off at some point later. Now, Ukraine's losses and the costs that come with it seem survivable to the oligarchs in Russia, like the Russians themselves, but only on one condition. Russia must come through this and look like a global power as a result. That projection, though, is being called into question. It is becoming clear that Russia is now alone, and alone, Russia cannot survive. Today, we see that for Vladimir Putin, the lies he has told his public are starting to catch up with him. My name is Dr. Jason Smart. I'm a special correspondent for the Kyiv Post and National Security Advisor. Iran is one of the last pillars holding up Putin's illusion. And this alliance with Iran, it's important for him because it suggests that sanctions can be bypassed. It suggests that weapons and components can still be sourced. It suggests Moscow will not be left alone if the war goes badly. When a partner looks brittle, that insurance stops working. What looked like strategic depth starts looking like a contagion. Elites do not want to be tied to a collapsing, losing partner. They start asking who is next. They start preparing for the bloc to shrink. The loyalty math flips when the elites sense that the bloc is becoming degraded. Commitment turns into hedging. People stop investing in the long game. They start protecting themselves from the system. But it's not only the elites in Moscow today that have their doubts about Vladimir Putin. In Iran, they also have plenty of reasons to have doubts. Iranians know history well. They know that Russia eats its friends when it gets hungry. And Iran's leadership, it doubts that Putin can really help them maintain power. Remember, Russia not too long ago failed to keep Yanukovych in power. It failed to prop up Assad. It failed to save Maduro. That leaves only one country of consequence that it can still count on. Now, centuries of experience deepen the Iranian skepticism. Moscow has treated Iran as a tool and not as an ally. Iran expects Russia to just demand loyalty, but then when it actually needs something, when pressure arises, that Moscow will walk away. That expectation shapes how Tehran judges Putin's promises today. Remember back in 1907, the Tsars carved up the north of Iran as a sphere of influence. Russia and Britain signed an agreement dividing Iran to control zones. Northern Iran went to Russia's zone. And of course, nobody bothered to ask the Iranians if they agreed with this. But Tehran learned a lesson in this. That great powers would trade Iranian territory like a bargaining chip. Back in 1941, the Soviets invaded, and this was after they made an agreement with Britain. Their goal was to have supply routes and control of logistics. They did not care about Iranian stability. In fact, the Shah was pushed out to remove resistance and to ensure compliance. His son, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, was installed as new Shah under occupation, and Iran stayed under Allied military presence for the rest of the war. Iran was simply used as a logistics corridor. By 1946, after the war had ended, Stalin still refused to leave Iran. Incredibly, Soviet forces stayed in the northern part of Iran even after the war ended. Now, Moscow-backed separatists there said they wanted to create their own Soviet state. And of course, Tehran was not very happy with this, and they appealed to the United Nations and others for assistance. The Soviet Union eventually withdrew only because of pressure, not because of goodwill. But the Russo-Iranian marriage of convenience we can project will only survive if the current economic system remains stable in both countries. But today in Iran, we see that's not the case. We see that the currency in Iran is collapsing. In fact, $1 is now worth 1.38 million rial, the national currency. Annual inflation is about 40%. Now, what that means in real terms is before, 1 week of basic groceries was about 11 to 12 hours of minimum wage work. Today, that same amount of groceries cost you 25 to 26 hours of minimum wage work. The rial has fell about 3.2 times, while minimum wages have risen about 1.5 times. The net result is that the same food basket costs about 2.2 times more than it did before. This is why we now see the protests that are touching 78 cities and 222 locations. The real danger emerges, though, with the bazaris, Those are the merchant class. They convert outrage into economic shutdown. And Iran is a very interesting case because commerce decides whether unrest stays protest or becomes total paralysis of the society. And in all revolutionary societies, if you look at them, you'll notice something similar. Strike duration matters more than the crowd size because it can shut down cash movement. Endurance signals the regime's fear tactics are failing to restart normal life. The bazaars are specific to Iran because they combine money flow and coordination into one network. And when closures synchronize, the state loses control of price, supply, and basic compliance. That legitimacy break forces the regime into a choice: concessions or escalating force. Iran's own history shows the rule in practice. In 1978 and 1979, bazaar networks sustained strikes and they were able to support the street protest. In 2009, the regime survived because commercial shutdown did not spread into durable nationwide choke points. Today, we see something else, though. If we look back at 2019, we saw the shock violence, and there the government was able to maintain control because it was able to isolate the people in the streets. Today's protests, though, are different. We see the protests are spreading much further. But in either case, for Vladimir Putin, he understands the mechanisms of Iran. He understands the logic, because it's very similar to the logic of his own regime. His regime is a coalition held together by cash, by fear, and the story of competence. Elite tolerance for the war holds only because the losses look like a price to pay for a strategic victory. Partners like Iran are part of the proof that Russia still matters globally. Tehran must look like a real pillar of power, not as a ceremonial friend, because if Iran destabilizes, Putin loses the insulation of his narrative immediately. He cannot claim that there are strategic depths. Rather, he himself begins to look brittle. He then will have to deny that they are in isolation, something that will become ever more obvious. But then the blame game accelerates in Moscow. When Ukraine is no longer just one of many fronts in a global war, but is the only front, meaning that you'd have to admit that Russia today is losing to a much smaller country, a country with which it started a war. But while the political layer thins, we see something else going on. We see that the pressure on Putin is mounting because he turned his back on a peace deal favorable to Moscow, and his country is watching as their military is being humiliated. A loitering munition just yesterday was able to destroy an S-300's radar system in Donetsk. This tracking system was important. It was there to intercept aircraft and missiles. Hitting the radar station blinded the system, leaving it unable to guide engagements. When air defense loses its eyes, gaps appear in the coverage. Those gaps make follow-on attacks routine. Commanders then face the political choice of which assets to leave unprotected. Likewise, industrial disruption becomes strategic when it creates bottlenecks that choke output. We saw the strike at the JSC Energia plant in Yelets. That plant was important for the Russians because it produced autonomous power sources for the Iskander-M missile. Without that, there's not going to be any more Iskander-M missiles. This was an important strike by the Ukrainians. But in the end of the day, there's something else going on that's important. Cheap mass attacks only work if the supply ecosystem behind them is still intact. Russia's drone campaigns rely on volume, and analysis project that it will be needing a lot more drones. In fact, it has ramped up from 200 Shahed launches per week to over 1,000 Shahed launches every single week of this war. But these Iranian-designed drones are used as cheap tools to saturate Ukraine's air defenses. That strategy depends on a fragile ecosystem, even with local manufacturing. Components and routing still touch external networks that can be and are being disrupted. But today, there's something else. We see that increasingly, Russia is not able to continue taking a tax coming from Ukraine. In fact, there has been 57 interceptions just now over the Moscow region. And this is part of a wider wave of over 1,548 drones that were destroyed the previous week over Russia. Now, what's incredible is just this year, every single day, Ukraine has attacked Russia with drones. Incredibly enough, it is Ukraine that is striking back. As Ukraine has taken the war to Russia. And these attacks, though, are doing something else. When Russians look externally, they see that things are not going well. They see that there are serious problems. They see that Venezuela is a big question. They see that no longer they count on Syria and the Mediterranean. They see that today it's not clear what will happen in Iran. Russia is truly becoming isolated. But domestically, they're being attacked regularly. The airports in Moscow are constantly being closed down. And within Russia, they see also there's more and more terrorism. We saw the derailment of trains in Russia and that Amur region that had over 35 cars go off the rails. Now, what's interesting about this is that whether it's caused by something like sabotage or if it's caused by rail decay, it's really the same reason. It's because of this war. The reason that there's so much rail decay in Russia is because they have had to cut the maintenance budgets. They simply don't have enough money today to maintain them. And as a result, there's more and more accidents. These accidents create more and more problems for the leadership in Moscow. And as a result, today, we see that they are unable to convince their own population that things are going well. Increasingly, it's becoming clear to the people of Russia that they're in a situation that's going to be very hard to get out of. But next week will show whether this noise is going to be a breaker, whether this will change things, whether this inflation that we see right now in Iran will actually be something that causes the Putin regime to also have its own fall. Today, on all fronts, we see that Russia shows stress through the visible breakdowns. The financial situation is rapidly degrading. We see the airports are closing due to Ukrainian strikes. Repression intensity is showing how afraid the regime has become. It shows what the state thinks it must do to keep control. Infrastructure failures expose decay because they reveal that the state cannot keep the system running. Ukraine shows its intent, though. It shows its intent to keep attacking Russia. It shows its intent of winning this war. And that is the difference. When Russia attacks Ukraine, it attacks its energy infrastructure, Russia's at no point closer to winning. It does it for motives of terrorism, to get the population to want to see the end of the war. But when Ukraine attacks Russia, it has a different motive. The objective here is to put the Russians on their back feet, so the Russians have to spread out their air defense, so the Russians cannot afford to continue fighting war. There's two totally different strategies. But today we see that Ukraine's strategy is working. Russia's strategy is not working. But in all cases, you can be sure of this. For Russia, things are going badly. But have no fear. There's something else happening right now that'll make it even worse. As always, thank you for supporting Ukraine.